The wall that changed everything. At 51, Valerie Reed believed she had seen it all: heartbreaks, fake friendships, professional rivalries, and the slow but steady erosion of youthful certainty. As Buffalo's most feared food critic, she wore her cynicism like a badge of honor, her reviews known to shutter restaurants and skyrocket chefs to stardom. Her palate was impeccable, her tongue sharp, her solitude self-inflicted. And yet here she was, clinging to a fiberglass climbing wall 15 feet off the ground, gasping, arms trembling, legs cramping, wondering how in the world a woman like her ended up chasing a story about extreme dining experiences for a feature her editor insisted would modernize her column. Gravity had never felt so personal, and humiliation never so complete. "Need a hand up there?" A voice called up, smooth, amused, warm in a way that didn't mock but gently teased. Valerie looked down and froze. A woman, perhaps in her early 30s, was watching her with concern wrapped in a smile. She was radiant, sun-kissed blonde hair tied into a messy ponytail, brown eyes glowing with a kind of playful confidence, and athletic grace that belonged more on a runway than in a grungy climbing gym. Valerie didn't reply immediately, half from pride, half from a flutter in her chest she couldn't quite name. "I'm fine," Valerie called down, though her grip was slipping by the second. The younger woman chuckled, not unkindly. "Sure you are. Want some technique tips before gravity wins this round?" And before Valerie could protest, the woman was scaling the wall beside her like it was a mere staircase. Her hands were sure, her feet found the holds with ease, and when she reached out to guide Valerie's hand, just lightly adjusting her grip, Valerie felt a jolt of something unfamiliar. Electric, yes. But not the embarrassing kind. It was warm, grounding, disarming. "Feel the difference?" she asked, now just a breath away. Valerie nodded, barely able to keep her composure. They climbed the last few feet together, and when they reached the top, Valerie allowed herself a rare, breathless laugh. Afterwards, over coffee in the attached cafe, they sat across from each other like old friends who hadn't yet realized they were meant to collide. Valerie learned her name, Amber Young. Age 30, occupation luxury food supplier. Not just any supplier, she sourced ingredients for half the high-end kitchens Valerie had critiqued for the last decade. When Amber realized who Valerie was, she burst into laughter. "No way, Valerie Reed? You wrecked Shaw Lauren last month." Called their $200 truffle risotto, a beige bowl of beige arrogance. Valerie smirked, sipping her latte. They earned it. Amber leaned back, grinning. "I told Marcel not to waste my truffles on his ego, pearls before swine." There was something magnetic in the way she said it, professional respect mingling with genuine amusement. For the first time in years, Valerie felt her guard falter. And when Amber offered to give her private climbing lessons, the idea sounded less like an offer and more like a possibility she didn't know she craved. 3 days later, they met again, this time at Amber's warehouse in Buffalo's old grain district. Valerie arrived early, clutching her voice recorder like armor. She told herself it was for a profile piece, strictly professional. But when Amber opened the loading dock doors in worn jeans and a clean white shirt, flashing that same easy smile, Valerie felt her pulse betray her. The tour was meant to be informational: cold storage rooms, rare spices, artisanal oils, beef from Japan, vanilla from Madagascar. But it became something else. When Amber handed her a spoon of Persian beluga caviar, fingers brushing, Valerie almost dropped it. Not from shock, but from the way a single touch could carry so much heat. Every time Amber leaned closer to show her something, Valerie's senses tangled. Her perfume was subtle but intoxicating, and when she smiled, the entire space felt dimmer in comparison. Eventually, Amber led her to a small, temperature-controlled room. "This is where I keep my real treasures. Only my favorite clients get access." The air felt heavier, intimate. Valerie tried to focus on the items, but Amber was inches away now, her arm brushing hers as she reached for a tiny jar of saffron threads. And when their eyes met, Valerie felt something crack, an emotional tectonic shift. "I should go," Valerie whispered. Amber didn't move. "Should you?" The kiss came not with urgency, but with permission. Soft, exploring, confusingly natural. Valerie hadn't kissed anyone in years, not since David left. Not since she had decided her heart was better encased in wit and work. But this kiss wasn't about identity. It wasn't about women or men or rules. It was about this moment, this woman, this overwhelming, earth-shifting now. She left the warehouse in a fog, telling herself it was a mistake, a momentary lapse, a flicker of curiosity. But that night, when Amber called to ask if she could deliver ingredients to her apartment personally, the tone of the offer made it hard to pretend. No, that's not necessary, Valerie said, but her voice lacked conviction. Maybe not necessary, Amber replied, voice softer now, but I'd like to. And just like that, the line between them became a wire stretched tight with anticipation. At 51, Valerie thought she'd already defined herself. But as she sat in front of her laptop trying to write the article about Amber's business, all she could see was Amber's smile. All she could smell was that warm perfume. And all she could feel was a dangerous question rising. What if I've never really known who I am? She stared at her reflection in the laptop screen. The silver strands in her hair glinted like truth. The woman staring back didn't look ashamed. She looked alive. The spoon, the silence, and the spark. The caviar still lingered on her tongue the next morning, even though Valerie had brushed her teeth twice. It wasn't just the taste of the food. It was the memory of that small spoon Amber had held up, the way her fingers had brushed against Valerie's when passing it, the silent, knowing look they shared when their lips hovered too close over a moment no longer professional. Valerie tried to busy herself with emails and scheduling out tastings for the rest of the week, but everything she did felt hollow, like background noise to something larger and unspoken now echoing through her chest. She had never been this distracted by a woman before. In fact, she'd never even noticed women like that. It wasn't that she had been repressing anything, at least not consciously. But it had never occurred to her after decades of marriage that her body could still be surprised. Or her heart. Softened. When the delivery arrived from Amber's warehouse just before noon, it wasn't a driver or an assistant. It was Amber herself. She stood in Valerie's doorway holding a sleek insulated bag with fresh ingredients and something else in her expression, gentleness paired with intention like she'd been thinking about this visit all morning. Valerie opened the door without her usual guarded tone. No witty remarks, no rehearsed sarcasm, just an exhale. "You didn't have to bring it yourself," Valerie murmured, stepping aside as Amber entered her apartment. "I wanted to," Amber replied, her voice casual, but her eyes scanning Valerie's face with that same unreadable intensity. "Besides, I brought something extra." Amber pulled out a small wooden container, opened it, and revealed two handmade ceramic bowls of what looked like soup, clear broth, hand-cut vegetables, delicate slices of mushroom, and a tiny sprig of something green floating like a final touch of magic. "It's an herbal broth I make after long travel weeks. Thought you could use something warming," she said. Valerie raised a brow. "You brought me lunch." "I brought us lunch." There was a pause. Valerie moved slowly toward the kitchen table, unsure if she was leading or being led. Amber placed the bowls down carefully, like they were more than food. She pulled out 2 spoons from the rolled cloth napkin and handed one to Valerie. But Valerie didn't take it. Her fingers hovered over the ceramic handle, then hesitated. Amber noticed. She leaned in gently and scooped a small portion into her own spoon, lifting it halfway between them. "Taste," she said softly. It should have felt awkward, even condescending. But there was something reverent about the gesture, like Amber wasn't feeding her as a child, but offering a part of herself. Valerie leaned forward and let the spoon touch her lips. The warmth flooded her mouth, an elegant balance of umami and spice, a flavor profile that told a story of earth, care, and subtlety. When she looked up, Amber hadn't moved, their eyes locked. "This is more than lunch," Valerie whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Amber tilted her head. "It doesn't have to be anything you don't want it to be." Valerie smiled, her heart aching with something that felt dangerously like yearning. "That's the problem. I think I want it to be." Amber didn't rush the moment. She simply nodded, then picked up her spoon and began eating silently, letting Valerie catch up to herself. They sat there in quiet warmth, only the occasional clink of spoon on bowl breaking the stillness. Outside, the city buzzed, car horns, barking dogs, wind scraping against window panes. But inside, Valerie's apartment had transformed. It no longer felt like a lonely place where she retreated from the world. It felt alive. After they finished, Amber stood and reached for her jacket, her tone shifting. "I'll see you Friday," she said, referring to their next climbing session. Valerie stood too, instinctively walking her to the door. "Right, Friday." Amber paused at the threshold, turning back. Her gaze was soft but unreadable. "You don't have to figure everything out all at once, Valerie. You just have to let yourself feel what you're feeling. That's enough." And then she was gone. Valerie stood at the door long after it closed. That night she wrote. She didn't write the article her editor wanted. She wrote about the soup, about the warmth, about hands that moved with purpose and eyes that seemed to see through defenses like they were thin glass. She wrote about firsts, not just the kiss, not just the way her body responded to Amber's nearness, but firsts of a deeper kind. The first time she allowed herself to sit in the unknown without judging it. The first time a part of her long sealed-off whispered, "I want to know more." The next few days moved with a strange duality, professional efficiency masking emotional chaos. Valerie went to tastings, wrote quick blurbs for the weekly food column, and attended an awards dinner where she was honored for outstanding contribution to culinary journalism. She smiled for pictures, clinked glasses with old colleagues, and laughed at predictable jokes about her deadly pen. But inside, all she could think of was Amber's voice saying, "Just let yourself feel." By the time Friday arrived, Valerie was halfway convinced she'd imagined the connection between them. Maybe she was going through a late-life crisis. Maybe she was misreading Amber's intentions. Maybe the kiss had been a moment of impulsive affection and not desire. She spent the entire cab ride to the climbing gym rehearsing how she would make things normal again. She would apologize if needed. She would retreat behind her usual wit and control. She would reset the boundary lines. Amber was already there when Valerie arrived, harness clipped, hair pulled back, climbing shoes on. She looked radiant and relaxed, talking with the young staff and helping a teenager tie his ropes. Valerie watched for a full minute before walking in. Amber turned the moment she entered, her expression lighting up like a room with all its lights turned on. "Hey, look who made it," she called warmly. Valerie smiled despite herself. The session began like before, Amber guiding, Valerie following. This time, though, there was an ease between them that hadn't been there before. When Amber touched her to correct her form, Valerie didn't flinch. When she made a joke about Valerie's death grip, Valerie laughed freely. And when they reached the top together again, they sat side by side, legs dangling over the edge. "I've been thinking," Valerie said slowly. "Dangerous habit," Amber teased. "I don't know what this is or what I'm doing, but I don't want to shut it down just because it scares me." Amber looked over at her, silent. "I want to keep seeing you," Valerie finished. Amber smiled, slow and luminous. "Then keep seeing me." They sat there for a long time. The first time Amber came over without food as an excuse, it was late. A Thursday, Valerie had sent a simple text. "Are you up?" Amber had responded in seconds. "Always." She arrived wearing a black hoodie, her hair still damp from a shower. No ingredients, no business, just her. Valerie opened the door and stepped aside. Nothing was said at first, just eyes. Amber took off her shoes. Valerie poured 2 glasses of wine. They sat on the couch, shoulders brushing, a documentary playing on the television that neither of them were really watching. Halfway through, Amber turned toward her and whispered, "Can I kiss you?" Valerie didn't answer. She leaned in. The kiss was slower this time. No heat of the warehouse, no adrenaline of confusion, just 2 women exploring the space between uncertainty and clarity. Valerie's hands found Amber's face, memorizing it with her palms, and when they parted, both women were breathless. "This is new for me," Valerie said, voice shaking. "I know," Amber replied. "It doesn't have to be fast, it just has to be honest." And so they built something not around labels, but around truth. One evening, Valerie found an old photo album buried under her bed. Pictures of her and David, her in her 20s beaming in white at their wedding, their trip to Paris, birthdays, Thanksgiving dinners, the smiles, the matching outfits, the carefully curated illusion. They divorced amicably 5 years ago. David had fallen for someone else, a woman 15 years younger. Valerie hadn't fought him. She was tired of trying to hold together a life that had long since unraveled. But looking at those pictures now, something strange stirred inside her, not sadness or regret, but a kind of quiet acknowledgement. She had loved him, in her way, but it had always felt like something she performed. With Amber, everything felt like something she uncovered. That weekend, Valerie invited Amber to a cooking class being hosted by one of her favorite chefs. It was a public event, and Valerie hesitated. Would people talk? Would someone recognize her? Would they wonder who this young woman was beside her? But when Amber walked into the room, took the apron from the instructor, and winked at Valerie like they were in on a secret only they understood, Valerie didn't care who saw. Amber chopped shallots like a professional, fed Valerie bites of sauce from the same spoon they both used, and whispered little jokes that made Valerie laugh so hard she nearly cried. Other participants smiled at them, not with suspicion, but warmth. At the end of the class, Valerie caught her reflection in a mirrored pillar. and she didn't look confused or scandalized or out of place. She looked radiant. Whispers between the walls. For the first time in over a decade, Valerie Reed found herself waking up before her alarm, not out of anxiety or deadlines or her usual guilt-ridden workaholic tendencies, but because her heart simply refused to stay quiet in the presence of something blooming. She lay still in bed, the weak light of Buffalo's gray sky pouring through her window, casting soft lines on the hardwood floor. On the far side of the room, her laptop sat closed for once, not blinking with untitled drafts or unfinished critiques. And in the kitchen, Amber moved with quiet confidence, barefoot, humming a tune Valerie couldn't name but felt like it had always belonged in this apartment. The air smelled like caramelized shallots and something nutty, brown butter maybe, and Valerie could hear the soft sizzling of something frying, delicate and intentional. It was surreal how naturally Amber fit into the space. Like she'd always been part of it, like she wasn't a disruption but a missing piece. Valerie sat up slowly, brushing her silver-streaked hair behind one ear, watching from the bedroom doorway as Amber plated what looked like golden frittata squares topped with microgreens and shaved cheese. She moved with that same easy elegance she had when climbing, strong, steady, unpretentious. There was no performance in her gestures, no exaggeration to impress, just clarity. And for Valerie, whose entire career was built on reading between the lines of culinary theater, Amber was like a breath of unfiltered air. She padded barefoot into the kitchen, and Amber turned, grinning as if she'd just won something. "You slept through the storm," Amber said. "Didn't even stir when the thunder rattled the windows." "I guess I was exhausted," Valerie replied, though she was. It had been the best sleep she'd had in years. They sat at the small wooden table near the window, quietly eating together, no morning radio, no urgency. Just two women in an apartment full of calm. Amber fed her another bite of frittata with a mischievous smile, and Valerie didn't flinch or laugh awkwardly like she had the first time. Instead, she leaned forward with ease, lips parting slightly, tasting not just food, but intimacy. Not just comfort, but intention. It was a quiet act, the kind that could unravel years of distance in a single moment. "I don't know what we're doing," Valerie said after a long pause, voice soft but honest. "I mean, I don't know where this goes, if it goes anywhere. I've never even let myself imagine this." Amber took a sip of her coffee and nodded, her gaze steady. "I don't need you to have it all figured out. I just need you to be real with me." Valerie exhaled, the breath feeling like a confession. "Then here's real. I like waking up with you here." Amber smiled but didn't speak. Instead, she reached across the table and took Valerie's hand. They sat like that for several minutes, a silence that didn't feel like a lack of words, but the presence of something truer than language. Later that week, Valerie received a call from her editor at the Buffalo Tribune, reminding her about the annual Women Who Lead feature series. Every year, Valerie profiled powerful female figures in various industries: chefs, restaurateurs, sommeliers. This year, the suggestion had come from the board to highlight a lesser-known face in the food supply chain, someone driving innovation from the background. Valerie knew immediately who she would nominate, but as soon as she hung up the phone, doubt crept in. What would it mean to write about Amber now? Would it expose too much? Could she do it fairly, without her growing feelings distorting the narrative? Would Amber even want to be featured? Their relationship, whatever it was, existed in a delicate liminal space, intimate yet undefined, powerful yet unspoken. Putting it in print would force the shape of it into something public. Valerie wasn't sure if it was bravery or sabotage. But Amber, when told, didn't hesitate. "Sure, I'll do it." Valerie blinked, just like that. Amber chuckled. "I'm not afraid of being seen, Valerie, but you have to be honest in the piece. No soft angles, no favors." Valerie felt a heat rise in her chest, part admiration, part intimidation. "You trust me that much?" Amber looked at her, eyes unwavering, voice even. "I think I already do." The interview took place in a small greenhouse annex behind Amber's warehouse. It was a glass-paneled haven filled with fresh herbs, hydroponic vegetables, and tiny citrus trees. The sunlight streamed in like filtered gold, illuminating the soft specks of dust dancing in the air. Valerie sat with her recorder balanced on her knee, notebook ready, heart hammering. Amber, seated opposite her in faded jeans and a black linen shirt, looked every bit the anomaly she was. Young, self-made, emotionally literate, and unintimidated by Valerie's reputation. "So," Valerie began, her professional tone coating the nerves beneath, "what drives your obsession with ingredients?" Amber smiled, leaning back in her chair. My mother, she said. She was a pastry chef in Toronto, single mom. Used to let me play in the pantry with sacks of flour and bottles of vanilla like they were toys. She couldn't afford babysitters, so I learned the weight of saffron threads before I learned algebra. Valerie wrote furiously, not just because the story was compelling, but because she could already see the emotional arc building. She asked about supply chains, about ethics, about the global network Amber had constructed in under 7 years. But somewhere between questions, the professional veil began to slip. Do you ever think about quitting? Valerie asked suddenly, surprising even herself. Amber blinked. Quitting what, the business? The performance, Valerie clarified. The relentless drive, the travel, the pressure to build something bigger every year. Amber looked away for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she looked back and said softly, all the time, but I never stop because I haven't yet built a place where I can rest. The words hit Valerie like a wave. A place where I can rest. She didn't write it down. She couldn't. It felt like a secret meant only for her. A week later, the first draft of the article was complete. It was sharp, emotional, and honest. Valerie had written it without flinching, highlighting Amber's innovation, ambition, and quiet resilience. She didn't downplay anything, but she also didn't sensationalize. The story wasn't about their connection. It was about Amber, and it was one of the best pieces Valerie had written in years. She emailed it to Amber late at night, then paced her apartment like a caged animal waiting for a response. An hour later, Amber replied, "You saw me, thank you." That was all, but it was enough. Their next few weeks unfolded like chapters in a quiet, vulnerable novel. They didn't define anything. There were no declarations, no ultimatums, just moments. Amber would drop by late with Moroccan dates and almond paste she'd smuggled from a recent supplier trip. Valerie would surprise her with handwritten notes slid into her tote bag, quoting lines from old food reviews no one else remembered. They kissed slowly often, but never rushed. They shared music, shared space, shared silence. And Valerie, once so certain of who she was, found herself less interested in answers and more fascinated by questions. Could it be that attraction wasn't always about gender, but about energy? Could love bloom in places you never planned to visit? Could two women with a 21-year age difference build something real? Late one night, curled beside Amber on the sofa, Valerie whispered, "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop." Amber turned her head slightly. "What do you mean?" "I don't know, that this is a phase, that I'm making a mistake, that I'll wake up and regret opening this door." Amber was quiet for a moment. Then she whispered back, "And if the door leads somewhere beautiful?" Valerie didn't reply. She just held Amber tighter. Then came the dinner party. Valerie had been invited to a private tasting hosted by one of Buffalo's rising chefs, a small, exclusive affair meant to celebrate the reopening of a historic restaurant. She was allowed a +1. For years, she'd gone alone to such events, preferring the solitude of her critique. But this time, she asked Amber. It wasn't easy. She almost backed out 3 times before texting the invite. But Amber responded with enthusiasm. "I'd be honored to be on your arm." They arrived together, Amber in a sleek navy dress, Valerie in black silk. Heads turned. Some eyes lingered longer than Valerie liked. An older couple she recognized from the industry gave her a curious, almost judgmental once-over. But Amber never flinched. She walked in proudly, hand brushing against Valerie's as they were seated. The evening unfolded in courses, each more complex than the last. But Valerie barely tasted the food. She was too focused on Amber's laughter, on the warmth in her own chest, on the fact that, for the first time in her career, she didn't feel alone in a room full of faces. Later, as they stood near the terrace watching the city lights flicker in the distance, Amber leaned close and whispered, "You're allowed to be seen, Valerie, not just for what you write, but for who you are." Valerie turned toward her, emotion rising in her throat. "What if I don't know who that is yet?" Amber smiled. "Then I'll help you find her." Everywhere the echo of her. It was a Thursday morning when Valerie first noticed how everything in her apartment had subtly shifted. The air smelled different, less sterile, more alive. There was a small white mug by the sink that wasn't hers, the handle worn by someone else's hand, a hair tie beside the bathroom mirror, a single dark green jacket hanging next to her trench coat in the hallway. None of these things shouted, yet all of them spoke. Amber had not officially moved in. There had been no such discussion, no cardboard boxes, no drawer-clearing ceremony, but her presence had rooted itself quietly, like herbs taking hold in soft soil. And Valerie, once so fiercely private and territorial about her space, didn't mind. In fact, she found herself reaching for those small traces of amber throughout the day, touching the hair tie absently while brushing her own hair, drinking from the white mug instead of her usual blue, catching the scent of amber's perfume on a scarf she'd left behind. Love, Valerie realized, didn't always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it crept in gently, like sunlight creeping across floorboards in the morning, reminding you that warmth can return without warning. Still, for all the emotional clarity growing between them, there remained the looming shadow of something unspoken, Valerie's past. Not just her marriage to David, but the entire life that had come before Amber. The life she had built with rules and borders, a career based on objectivity, a reputation for detachment, a heart long trained to hide behind sharp sentences and unshakable independence. And now here she was, unlearning everything at 51, and yet feeling more like herself than ever before. But what haunted her in the quieter moments wasn't confusion about her sexuality or society's judgment. It was fear. Fear of not knowing how to be soft without losing control, fear of needing someone without becoming dependent, fear of loving someone so deeply that her own reflection would change forever. That weekend, Amber invited her to Toronto. "My mother wants to meet you," she said simply, over roasted chicken and parsnip puree at Valerie's dining table. Valerie blinked, fork paused midair. "Your mother knows about us?" Amber tilted her head, amused. "She knew about you before I did, the moment I told her I couldn't stop rereading one woman's food reviews and had memorized her voice from a single voicemail," she said. "You're in trouble." Valerie laughed softly, but her stomach fluttered. "Are you sure? I mean, it's only been a few months." Amber reached across the table and gently took her hand. "You wrote an article about my business that changed how people saw me. You kissed me in a warehouse full of truffles and Persian saffron. You wake me up with silence and tenderness every time I stay here. I think that counts for something." Toronto was a 3-hour drive, and they made the journey in Amber's old SUV with the windows slightly cracked and playlists shuffling between indie folk and old jazz. They didn't talk much, just held hands loosely between the seats, letting the road stretch ahead like a story they hadn't written yet. Amber's mother lived in a modest brownstone lined with vines and flower boxes. She was a short, silver-haired woman with a quick wit and hands that always seemed to be either baking or blessing. When she opened the door, she hugged Valerie as if she'd known her for years, and that simple gesture nearly undid Valerie's carefully managed composure. They spent the day talking, eating, laughing over stories of Amber's childhood mischief. Valerie was surprised by how easily she slipped into the rhythm of their dynamic, two women so comfortable in their love for Amber that there was no competition, no need to prove worth. But it wasn't until that evening, while Amber washed dishes and her mother and Valerie sat sipping tea in the living room, that the conversation turned deeply personal. "She's been hurt before," Amber's mother said softly, not accusing, just observing. "By women who loved the idea of her but couldn't stand beside her when the world looked too closely." Valerie's breath caught. "I won't be one of them," she said before she could stop herself. The older woman looked at her, eyes full of knowing. "Then don't be. Love her with both hands, not one always ready to pull away." That night back at the small guest room Amber's mother had prepared for them, Valerie lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Amber curled against her side, sleeping peacefully, completely at ease. And Valerie felt it, something shift inside her, not just attraction, not even just love, but conviction. She didn't want to live another decade half alive, half protected. She wanted to be known. And she wanted Amber to know all of her, not just the polished public self, but the scared girl still learning to trust tenderness after years of silence. When they returned to Buffalo, life resumed with the quiet rhythm they had created, but Valerie found herself more open, less afraid of letting Amber into her everyday routines. She invited her to readings, brought her to tastings, even introduced her to a few close industry friends. The looks they received were mixed, some approving, some curious, some quietly judgmental. But Amber never flinched, and Valerie began to understand something fundamental about courage. It wasn't about announcing your love to the world with billboards or parades. It was about not hiding it. One evening, as they cooked dinner side by side, Valerie chopping herbs, Amber stirring a risotto, Valerie asked, "Have you ever been in love like this before?" Amber didn't pause. "No, I've loved people. I've been with women who were beautiful, smart, funny, but this," she turned to face Valerie fully. This feels like the first time I've been building something real, not just heat, not just romance, but presence. Valerie felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. She blinked them away. I'm terrified sometimes. Amber stepped forward and brushed her thumb along Valerie's cheek. Me too, but we do it anyway. The next week, Valerie's editor called again. We want you on the podcast. Valerie frowned. What for? To talk about the Amber piece. It's gotten traction and people are asking questions about your perspective, your tone. Some are calling it your most personal piece yet. Valerie sat still. Her first instinct was to decline. She had spent a lifetime curating distance, constructing walls of professional neutrality. But then she thought of Amber, of that first climbing lesson, of the spoon that started it all. She thought of the Toronto kitchen and Amber's mother telling her, "Love her with both hands." So she agreed. The recording studio was warm and quiet. Valerie wore headphones and sat across from the host, a bright young journalist with a thoughtful expression. So, the host began, "You've written hundreds of restaurant reviews, but this profile on Amber Young felt different, more like a love letter." Valerie smiled. Maybe it was. The host raised a brow. Would you say it changed you? Valerie didn't hesitate. Absolutely. It reminded me that the most important ingredient in any dish, any life, is risk, the willingness to be seen, to taste something unfamiliar, to admit when your palate has changed. After the interview aired, messages flooded in. Some supportive, some surprised, a few cruel, but the majority were from readers, women, older and younger, who wrote, "Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to begin again." Valerie read each message aloud to Amber that night, her voice cracking as they sat curled up on the couch. "You're changing people," Amber whispered. "No," Valerie said, resting her head on Amber's shoulder. "You changed me, and I'm just writing it down." Where the light stays longest. Autumn fell across Buffalo like warm velvet that year, quieter and more golden than Valerie remembered in recent memory. The trees outside her apartment shifted into hues of rust and flame, the sidewalks cluttered with crisp leaves that crunched under boots as the city prepared to retreat inward. But Valerie didn't feel the familiar sense of melancholy that usually crept in with the cooler winds. She felt full, strangely, profoundly full in a way that frightened her with its simplicity. It wasn't that everything was perfect. She still had deadlines. Her body still creaked when she got up too fast. There were still moments, small ones, when she caught her reflection and questioned who exactly was staring back. But there was no longer a sharpness to that question, no self-directed ridicule. There was only softness now. And most of it had something to do with the woman who, on this particular morning, stood barefoot in her kitchen, humming under her breath as she made pancakes with the same reverence she gave to imported truffles. Amber had started staying over more frequently, sometimes for a night, sometimes for 3, and then one day, without a word spoken or decision formally made, her toothbrush appeared in the holder beside Valerie's. Her books began stacking on the living room shelf. Her spices, saffron, star anise, smoked salt, lined the left side of the pantry. Her laughter began echoing in the shower. There was no announcement. It was not a grand, dramatic merge of lives. It was something gentler, like roots beneath soil quietly growing toward each other. One morning, Amber brought Valerie coffee in bed, climbed back under the covers, and kissed her shoulder before whispering, "I'm starting to feel like this is home." Valerie hadn't answered with words. She only turned, kissed her lips slowly, and let her fingers tangle into Amber's. But in her heart she thought, "Me too, even if I didn't know I was looking for home." What surprised Valerie most about this new love wasn't the intensity, it was the calm. The way Amber didn't demand to be her everything. The way she left room for silence, for breath, for solitude. Some evenings they sat in the same room reading different books, exchanging only the occasional glance. Sometimes Amber left for 3 days to travel for supplier visits, and Valerie didn't panic or spiral into abandonment. They didn't text obsessively. There was trust now. A rhythm. A kind of freedom that didn't look like distance, but felt like respect. But love, especially love born later in life, has its shadows. One of them came in the form of a message Valerie didn't expect, from David. It arrived in her inbox on a Wednesday evening. Subject line, coffee. The message was short, polite. "Hi Val, heard through a mutual friend that your Tribune piece on Amber Young is getting national attention. Congrats, would love to catch up. Just coffee, no weirdness, let me know." Valerie stared at the screen for several minutes, unsure why her hands felt cold. David wasn't a villain. Their marriage hadn't ended with a scream, but with a sigh. He'd fallen in love with a woman 15 years younger, and Valerie had let him go. They had split everything evenly, sold the house, agreed on visitation with the dog until he passed. There had been no betrayal, only weariness. But now, seeing his name again felt like time collapsing. Like all her chapters were stacking on top of each other. Old love, the version of herself who had chosen safety for years suddenly brushing against the one who now kissed a woman's shoulder every morning. That night, she told Amber. They were curled up on the couch watching a food documentary, Amber's head on her lap, fingers absent-mindedly tracing Valerie's knee. "He emailed me," Valerie said softly. Amber looked up. "David." Valerie nodded. "Wants to have coffee." Amber didn't flinch, didn't accuse, didn't shift into defensiveness. She only asked, "Do you want to?" Valerie was quiet. "I don't know, maybe just to see." Amber reached up, cupped her face gently. "Then go, you don't need my permission." Valerie's eyes stung. "I'm not afraid of him, I'm afraid of who I used to be around him." Amber kissed her palm. "You're not that woman anymore, but even if you were, I'd still love her." The cafe was one Valerie hadn't visited in years, small, tucked in the corner of Elmwood, the kind with handwritten menus and oversweetened cappuccinos. David was already there, seated near the window, his salt and pepper hair shorter than she remembered, his face a little softer, more lived in. He stood when she approached, smiled that familiar, cautious smile. "Val," he said, "you look good." She sat. "You look like someone who still gets sympathy from waitresses." He laughed, relieved. "Some things never change." The conversation was light at first. Weather, politics, her article, his upcoming move to Boston. Then came the inevitable shift. "I read the piece on Amber," he said. "It was different, personal." Valerie sipped her coffee, watching him. "It was." He hesitated. "You're with her." "I am." He nodded slowly. "I always wondered if there was more to you than what I saw." Valerie tilted her head. "There was, but I didn't know it then either." David looked almost wistful. "I'm glad you found it." She searched his face for resentment or curiosity or even fascination, but all she found was peace. "I am too," she said. And just like that, something unspoken was released. She wasn't afraid anymore, not of him, not of her past, not even of the future. She was free. Winter crept in early that year, laying frost across the city like lace. Valerie began waking up to the sound of Amber's soft breathing beside her, watching steam rise from mugs as they sat on the balcony wrapped in blankets. They cooked more. They talked more. They loved quietly and consistently. Valerie started reading queer memoirs. Amber showed her old love letters she'd written and never sent. They built something not defined by age or orientation or any label, but by presence, by showing up. One night after a snowstorm, the power went out. They lit candles, wrapped themselves in coats, and made grilled cheese on a camping stove. They laughed like teenagers, fell asleep with their noses cold and hearts warm. And somewhere in that darkness, Valerie whispered, "I would have missed all of this if I had stayed the person I was 5 years ago." Amber, half asleep, whispered back, "Then thank God you changed." A month later, Valerie's editor offered her a new column, not just restaurant reviews, but personal essays, reflections on food and aging and reinvention. The Tribune's analytics had shown an unusual spike in readership. People weren't just hungry for critique. They were hungry for connection, for vulnerability. She accepted, and in her first piece she wrote, "The taste of becoming." It was the scent of roasted figs and thyme that pulled Valerie back from the edges of her self-doubt that evening. A familiar warmth filling the apartment, mingling with the low hum of jazz and the crackle of something baking. Amber was barefoot again, swaying slightly in the kitchen, her golden hair pinned up in a soft knot, wearing Valerie's oversized sweater like it had always belonged to her. Outside, winter pressed its cold palms against the windows, but inside, everything glowed. The overhead lights were dimmed, candles flickered on the table, and the atmosphere was so tender it felt like breath could shatter it. Valerie stood in the doorway, watching her, holding a small envelope in her hand. She had carried it around for a week, unsure if she would ever open it. It was from the National Food Writing Guild, an invitation to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award, the kind of honor her younger self would have killed for. But now, in this strange new chapter of her life, Valerie wasn't sure what it even meant to be honored for a lifetime that had only recently begun to feel like her own. Amber looked up and smiled when she noticed her. "Dinner's almost done, but you've got that face that says you're thinking too hard again." Valerie crossed the kitchen, leaned in, kissed Amber's forehead, and held out the envelope. This came last week. Amber read it silently, then raised her eyebrows. Wow, you should go. Valerie hesitated. I don't know, it feels complicated, like they're honoring someone I used to be, someone who wrote from behind walls. Amber leaned against the counter, folding her arms, eyes soft. Maybe it's not about honoring who you were. Maybe it's about recognizing how far you've come. You're still writing, still tasting, but now you're feeling, and people can tell. Valerie sighed, holding her gaze. Would you come with me? Amber blinked. To New York. Valerie nodded. Amber smiled. Only if I get to wear the deep green dress that makes you stare. Valerie chuckled, wrapping her arms around her. Deal. The event was held in an old Manhattan ballroom. High ceilings, arched windows, chandeliers glittering like frozen tears. Valerie hadn't been in this room since the early 2000s, when she sat in the back taking notes and watching bigger names receive applause. But now, her name was etched on the program cover in gold ink. As she stepped inside with Amber beside her, elegant in that green dress, her hand resting lightly on Valerie's back, she felt the weight of her own history pressing against the satin of her gown. She saw colleagues she hadn't spoken to in years, editors who once feared her critiques, writers she had mentored in brief passing comments that apparently meant more than she ever realized. And she saw the looks, a few curious stares, a few raised brows, two women together, an age gap. A public figure walking with a quiet defiance. But she also saw something else, recognition, respect, the kind that went deeper than politeness, the kind that said, you made it here on your terms. During the award speech, Valerie stood under the spotlight, hands slightly trembling. She glanced at the speech she had written the night before, folded neatly in her hand. Then she placed it on the podium without reading it. I spent most of my life writing about taste, she began, her voice steadier than she expected. About the notes that linger, the balance of salt and sweet, the layers we discover when we slow down long enough to savor. She paused, searching for Amber in the crowd, found her watching with that quiet flame in her eyes. But I never imagined I'd be standing here after learning that my own life still had flavors I hadn't yet tasted. I thought I knew who I was. I thought I had finished becoming. But then, someone offered me something new, and I said yes, and it changed everything. There was silence, then applause, not loud, not thunderous, but real. Afterward, as they stood in the quiet hallway beyond the ballroom, Valerie turned to Amber. That was terrifying. Amber smiled. You were perfect. Valerie laughed, tears threatening. I keep thinking, what if none of this had happened? What if I hadn't gone to that stupid climbing gym? Amber stepped closer. Then I would have fed someone else soup, but it wouldn't have tasted the same. They kissed under the hallway's arched light, not caring who passed by. Months passed. The column grew. Letters poured in from women across the country, many older, some younger, some questioning, some simply grateful. They shared stories of late-blooming truths, secret loves, shattered expectations, and rediscovered joy. One letter came from a 72-year-old widow who wrote, I thought I buried the last part of myself when my husband died. But after reading your story, I booked a pottery class with the woman I've admired for years. Thank you for reminding me that we are never too old to begin again. Valerie kept that letter taped above her writing desk. Amber's business continued to expand, and sometimes Valerie accompanied her on trips to Paris, to Morocco, to Napa. They worked from hotel beds, fed each other samples, wrote side by side in cafes. There were arguments, too, silences, fears that flared up like old scars, but they stayed. They always stayed. And every time they chose each other again, the foundation deepened. One night, as they sat on a blanket at Delaware Park watching the stars blink faintly above the city lights, Amber reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small. I found this today, she said, holding out a tiny silver spoon charm on a chain. Reminded me of the one that started all this. Valerie took it, throat tightening. It really did start everything, didn't it? Amber nodded. I didn't mean to fall for you, Val, but once I did, I couldn't stop. Valerie clasped the chain around her neck, the charm resting over her collarbone. I'm glad you didn't. Then she leaned over, kissed her under the open sky, and felt something inside her settle. Not in a way that closed the chapter, but in a way that said, now, finally, the story is truly yours. The woman I became at her table. There are moments in life that feel like bookmarks, small, silent pauses that mark the exact point where everything before was one version of you, and everything after became another. Valerie Reed had lived through many of those over the course of her 51 years. Her first byline, her wedding day, the quiet final conversation with David over lukewarm coffee and mutual exhaustion, the Tribune's office celebration when she hit her 500th review. But none of those moments had lodged themselves in her soul quite like the quiet click of Amber's spoon against her lips that day in the warehouse, half professional, half personal, and completely unintentional. And now, almost a year later, as she stood before a group of students at a culinary writing workshop, she found herself telling that story, not as a punchline or a confession, but as a truth she had finally made peace with. The room was filled with mostly young women, some shy, some bold, some balancing gig work with dreams of food columns and travel assignments. Valerie had been invited to speak about the intersection of food and identity, but what she delivered instead was a soft, steady talk about how taste is only half the story. "We write about what we can name," she told them, her voice steady, "but the real stories live in what we didn't know we were hungry for." When the talk ended, a few students lingered, thanking her, sharing fragments of their own secret cravings, for reinvention, for truth, for love they hadn't yet had the courage to name. Valerie saw in them what she hadn't seen in herself for years, possibility without expiration. That evening, Amber met her outside the college auditorium, waiting beneath a row of amber-colored street lamps that glowed like open hands in the dusk. She wore a scarf loosely draped over her coat, cheeks flushed from the wind, eyes bright with pride. "I heard the whole thing," Amber said, linking her arm through Valerie's. "You were brilliant." Valerie smiled softly. "I still can't believe this is my life." Amber leaned closer. "You built it, one choice at a time." They walked in silence for a few moments, the city moving gently around them, a symphony of car horns, distant music, and the soft percussion of their steps on fallen leaves. Back at home, Valerie placed a small ceramic plate on the dining table, a gift she'd bought during their last trip to Portugal, hand-painted with olive branches and etched with the word Renascimento, Portuguese for rebirth. She filled it with green olives, a wedge of manchego, and 2 spoons of honeycomb. Amber poured wine, and as they sat across from each other, Valerie felt something rise in her, not urgency, not fear, but a gentle ache for permanence. "I want to write something else," she said. Amber tilted her head. "Another column." Valerie shook her head. "A book, not about restaurants, not reviews, a story, my story, our story, about how you helped me discover the rest of me I didn't know I'd buried." Amber was quiet, her smile tender. "Then I'll clear the weekends and the weekdays, whatever it takes, because I want the world to know who you became when you finally let yourself be loved." The book took 8 months. It wasn't easy. Valerie wrestled with her own voice, with doubt, with how much to reveal. But Amber was there for all of it, editing pages, offering tea, coaxing her through writer's blocks, reminding her always that truth doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. The manuscript was raw, funny, defiant, and deeply vulnerable. When she sent it to her agent, she didn't sleep for 2 nights. But when the reply came back with just 2 words, "It's beautiful," Valerie wept. Not because of the validation, but because she realized she had finally spoken for herself, without hiding behind critique or columns or sarcasm. The publisher titled the book, "The Spoon and the Silence." Valerie added the subtitle, "A late-blooming love letter to taste, truth, and a 30-year-old woman who fed me more than food." It went on to become a national bestseller. The greatest joy didn't come from sales. It came from the letters, again, more this time. Handwritten notes, typed messages, emails from daughters, sisters, grandmothers. One read, "I came out to my daughter after reading your story. She cried and said, 'I knew, Mom, I was just waiting for you to be ready.'" Another, "I'm 59. My wife passed 10 years ago. I thought I'd buried love with her, but I just said yes to dinner with someone new. Thank you for reminding me it's never too late." Valerie kept every letter in a wooden box beside her desk. The night before the book's launch party in New York, Amber surprised her. They were in their apartment, candles lit, music low. Valerie had just finished ironing the dress she planned to wear when Amber asked her to come out onto the balcony. The city stretched beneath them, golden and alive. Amber held something in her hands. Valerie stepped closer. "What's this?" Amber didn't speak. She simply opened the small box and revealed a ring, delicate, elegant, a band of white gold in the shape of a spoon wrapping around itself. Valerie stared, stunned. "It's not a proposal," Amber said softly. "Not yet, just a promise that whatever comes next, I'll be beside you, feeding you courage, spoon by spoon." Tears welled up in Valerie's eyes as she took the ring, slipped it onto her finger, and pulled Amber into an embrace that spoke everything her words couldn't. The next day, they stood hand in hand as Valerie addressed a crowd of readers, friends, and fellow writers. And this time, there was no trembling. "I was 51 when I discovered I had been starving in ways I couldn't name," she said. "Not for food, not for praise, but for the permission to be something new. I thought love had passed me by, that I was too old to change, too set in my ways, too late to begin again. But then, someone fed me from her own spoon, and everything I thought I knew about myself shifted. I am here today not because I finally figured it all out, but because I stopped needing to." The audience stood, not in politeness, but in solidarity. And as Amber stepped beside her, slipping her hand into Valerie's once more, they looked out at the crowd, and then at each other. Two women, one love, infinite beginnings.